The Picture Book of Sacagawea by David Adler, illustrated by Dan Brown. I have my helpers here. I have Lucas and Audrey, Evelyn, and Charlotte, and Jackson here helping today. Sacagawea was born in 1788 or 1789 in the western Rocky Mountains. She was a Native American, a Shoshone. The Shoshone lived in teepees. They moved to gather food as the seasons changed. They ate seeds, berries, roots, and insects. Ew! In the spring and the winter, they fished, and in the fall, they hunted bison. The Shoshone hunted jackrabbits, antelope, and other animals too. They used branches to make beautiful baskets, bowls, hats, and traps. Lucas, you're such a good listener. The Hidatsa were taller and lighter skinned than the Shoshone. They spoke a different language too. The Hidatsa didn't move around to gather food. Instead, they planted corn, beans, squash, sunflowers, and tobacco. They lived in large, round, earthen houses, made pottery, and built boats for travel on the Missouri River. Sacagawea worked in the fields. She also helped to dry the vegetables and to store them for the winter. Sacagawea lived and worked among the Hidatsa, but she was still their captive. After a few years, the Hidatsa sold Sacagawea to Toussaint Charbonneau, a white trader and trapper. Charbonneau was in his 40s. He was a rough, loud man. He had a wife and son. He bought Sacagawea to be his second wife. Good job, Lucas. In 1804, two white explorers, Captain Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, and their corps of discovery of some 40 soldiers, frontiersmen, and boatmen were sent by President Thomas Jefferson to expose the Missouri River and find a route to the Pacific Ocean. They were to draw maps, discover new plants and animals, and learn about the Native Americans who lived in the West, telling them about the United States. On their way up the river, the Corps encountered several Native American several Native American tribes, including the Yankton Sioux, the Teton Sioux, and the Arikaras. Soon after Sacagawea was sold, the Corps arrived at the Hidatsa village where she lived. Lewis and Clark arrived and stirred quite a bit of attention. The Hidatsa had never seen a flat-bottomed keelboat like the one the explorers traveled on, nor had they ever heard of violin music. But York, Captain York's slave, was their greatest surprise. He was the first black man that they had ever seen. Lewis and Clark met with the local chiefs. Then they and their men prepared for the winter. They cut down trees and they built a fort, Fort Mandan, with 8 small log cabins inside. Charbonneau went with Sacagawea to meet Lewis and Clark. He gave them bison skin robes and said he could help them. While he couldn't speak all the languages of the different tribes, Lewis and Clark would meet. He would talk with them and use sign language. Charbonneau was hired as an interpreter. Because the group would pass through Shoshone territory, Sacagawea would accompany them. Charbonneau and Sacagawea stayed in Fort Mandan with the explorers through the very cold winter. Sacagawea was pregnant, and in February 1805, her son, Jean-Baptiste, was born. By early April, the frozen Missouri River began to melt. The explorers saw geese flying north. They sent the keelboat and some men back to St. Louis with reports for President Jefferson and 9 boxes of animal skins, plants, stuffed birds, and snakes. They also sent a pair of elk horns and cages carrying a live squirrel, a hen, and 4 magpies. Lewis and Clark and their Corps of Discovery began their trip west. Sacagawea was the only woman along. She traveled with her baby in a cradle board tied to her back. At 2 months old, Jean-Baptiste was the youngest member of the group. From the beginning, Sacagawea was an important member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. On the second day out, she collected edible roots for the men. Later, she gathered wild strawberries, plums, gooseberries, and currants. On May 14th, a gust of wind pushed one of the explorers' boats onto its side. Charbonneau panicked and dropped the rudder. The boat filled with water. While the men struggled to save the boat, Sacagawea saved the instruments and medicines that had fallen overboard. On August 12th, that's your mommy's birthday, guys. On August 12th, the group crossed the Continental Divide, the line of high land that separates the rivers flowing east to the Atlantic from those flowing west to the Pacific. The next day, they met Sacagawea's people. The Shoshone. Captain Clark wrote in his journal that on seeing them, Sacagawea danced for the joyful sight. Captains Lewis and Clark met in a tent with the Shoshone leader, Chief Kamawait. They smoked a peace pipe together and then sent for Sacagawea, who spoke Shoshone. Sacagawea began to interpret. Then she looked at the chief and she jumped up. She ran to the chief, hugged him, and cried. Chief Kamawait was Sacagawea's brother. With Sacagawea's help, the Shoshone traded a number of horses to the explorers. They also gave them a guide who helped them west through the Bitterroot Range of the Rocky Mountains. The explorers, that looks cold. The explorers continued west down the Columbia, Clearwater, and Snake Rivers. It was a difficult journey. They encountered grizzly bears and rattlesnakes. At times they were so cold that one of the men wrote in a journal that our moccasins froze. Other men wrote, fatiguing beyond description, and of hunger. The men are growing weak and losing their flesh very fast. We are obliged to kill a second colt for our supper. Along the way, the explorers met many other tribes. Clark wrote in his journal that seeing Sacagawea convinced these people of our friendly intentions, because among them, no woman ever accompanied a war party, and surely not a woman with her baby. In early November, the Corps saw sea otters swimming in the river and knew that they were getting close to the Pacific Ocean. Then they heard the roar of the waves, and Captain Clark wrote in his journal, ocean in view. Oh, the joy! For Sacagawea, seeing what she called the great waters and the remains of a beached whale, which she called a monstrous fish, were highlights of the trip. It was late in the year. Snow and ice blocked their way back. And at the edge of the Pacific Ocean, they built Fort Clatsop. They stayed there through difficult winter and almost constant rain and cold until March 23rd, 1806, when they began their journey home. In August, the explorers reached Fort Mandan. This was the end of the journey for Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and Jean-Baptiste. In September, Captains Lewis and Clark reached St. Louis. They brought back maps and information about the geography, animals, and the resources of the region. They also made peaceful contact with many Native American tribes. In December 1806, message to Congress, President Jefferson wrote that the Lewis and Clark expedition has had all the success which could have been expected. Lewis and Clark and their brave companions have by this arduous service deserved well of their country. Little is known of Sacagawea after the expedition. Some historians believe that she died of the putrid fever some years later on December 20th, 1812. Others say she returned to the Shoshone people and died among them more than 70 years later on April 9th, 1884. But whatever her later history, during her 17 months as part of the Lewis and Clark expedition, she helped to assure the success of the journey and open up the continent to the people of the United States. A river in Montana, lakes in Washington and North Dakota, and mountains in Montana, Wyoming, Oregon, and Idaho have been named for her. There are numerous statues and markers across the United States, and now a dollar coined to honor her. Important dates: 1788 or 1789, born in western Rocky Mountains in present-day Idaho. 1799, captured by Hidatsa and given the name Sacagawea, which means bird woman. 1803, the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory from France. May 4th, 1804, Lewis and Clark began their journey of discovery from Camp Dubois near St. Louis, Missouri. November 1804, Sacagawea, along with her husband, joined Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery at the newly built Fort Mandan. February 1805, son Jean-Baptiste was born. April 7th, 1805, expedition left Fort Mandan. April 16th, 1805, expedition reached the Columbia River. November 1805, expedition reached the Pacific Ocean. And in August 1806, the expedition returned to Fort Mandan. Sacagawea died either December 20th, 1812 or April 9th, 1884. Author's note: Sacagawea's birthplace is in present-day Idaho. The Hidatsa village was in today's North Dakota. When Sacagawea was with the Shoshone, it is believed her name was Hiho or Hushu, which means little bird. The Hidatsa are also known as the Minatari. According to some sources, Charbonneau didn't buy Sacagawea. He won her in a game of chance. Captain Clark gave York his freedom soon after the return of the expedition. Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, Sacagawea's son, and the youngest member of the expedition, later became a fur trader and an explorer. He spent some time at Bent's Fort in Colorado and was described in a journal kept there as the best man on foot on the plains or in the Rocky Mountains. In the mid-1840s, he traveled to California, where he settled and remained until 1866. In the spring of that year, he headed to the gold fields of Montana when he became ill and died. The end. Bye, everybody. Grandma loves you. Say bye, Ed.
Bye.